Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us this morning. My name is Caitlin Backer, and welcome to It's Not Me, It's You, Boundary Setting and Exit Strategies in Evidence Synthesis Projects. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to let my two co-presenters introduce themselves. Erin, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Erin Reardon. I'm a public health informationist at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
And hi, I'm Nicole Thiesmahan. I'm an evidence synthesis librarian and collections coordinator at the University of Minnesota.
And as I said, I'm Caitlin Backer, and I'm the Discovery Technologies librarian at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, Canada. Next slide, please. So today we wanted to go over a couple of case studies, or technically three case studies that we have. So I'm going to start us off with some introduction and framing. We're going to go through each of our case studies and talk about the problems that we see within them, some potential mitigation strategies, and then some questions that one may want to ask themselves. And we would encourage you to add your thoughts or your questions or comments to the chat as we go. So if you do happen to maybe relate to a particular story, or if you have suggestions for how you might address a particular challenge or a question you might ask, we would just encourage you to participate in that way. And then we're going to conclude with some strategies overall and some concluding thoughts. Next slide, please.
In the chat, there is a question. Do we want them to say things in the chat or in the Q&A? I would say definitely pipe up in the chat if you have tips and other stuff for what we're talking about. But if you have a question, to use the Q&A. Sorry, Caitlin, go ahead.
No, thanks, Erin. So first wanted to lay some groundwork in terms of why it is that we felt that this sort of session might be helpful. And part of that is just that many of us have seen a growth in evidence synthesis projects. So there was a study that was published about a year and a half ago now, in which they were looking at just the extent of support for evidence syntheses. And in that survey, they found that 26% of the respondents supported at least 10% or 10 projects within the last 5 years. Now, I will say that was quite a spectrum. There were some individuals who were reporting supporting hundreds of projects. I believe the largest number were 500 projects within a 5-year period. So certainly not an insignificant volume. In terms of the time that is allocated towards these, another project found that on average, librarian time for an evidence synthesis project is almost 31 hours per project. And again, that can vary significantly. The maximum time that this particular project found was over 200 hours for one evidence synthesis project for a single librarian. So certainly there is a growth in the number of projects people are being involved in, and there's a fairly extensive time commitment to being involved within an evidence synthesis project. And librarians who support systematic reviews have reported moderate levels of burnout overall. Next slide, please. So we did want to just kind of discuss what it is that we're referring to when we talk about burnout, because there is kind of almost a pop cultural use of burnout, where it's kind of a shorthand to mean I'm tired or I'm stressed, and that is absolutely valid. But it is actually also a medical diagnosis. The World Health Organization does have an official definition of this. It is an ICD-10 code that medical professionals can use. And it is officially a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And so the WHO associates it with feelings of depletion or energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, feelings of negativity, feeling cynical, specifically in relationship to one's job, and then a sense of ineffectiveness or a lack of accomplishment. And these characterizations, these dimensions can manifest in many different ways. This could include fatigue, difficulty concentrating, brain fog, difficulty making decisions, a lack of motivation, and so on. There can also be physical manifestations of burnout. Oftentimes, it's associated with sleep issues, things like insomnia, for example, as well as behavioral manifestations, interpersonal conflicts, or some of those challenges in relationships are fairly frequently reported. And the WHO is very specific that this is about workplace stress and that it shouldn't be extended to other parts of one's life. But even within that definition, although it is associated with your work self and your professional self, it has implications beyond that. These feelings of burnout, even when they are caused by workplace stress, manifest, as I said, in those physical ways, which can impact your life, those behavioral ways. It's also associated with things like lower feelings of self-esteem, feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety. So it really has potential to impact quality of life overall. But one thing that we did just want to flag, next slide, please, is that even though there is this definition of what burnout is, we're really not trying to tell anyone what they should be doing. So what my personal feelings of what causes chronic stress or what successful management strategies are may be entirely different than what would work for Erin or what would work for Nicole or what would work for anybody else. All of these things are deeply personal, and so we're not trying to tell anyone what should or should not be their stressors or what strategies they should or should not be using or what anyone should be doing. We're really trying to share our experiences, some patterns that we've noticed in our own work, and to offer some perspective, some reflections and considerations that we hope might be helpful for other people. So on that note, I am going to turn things over to Erin. Next slide, please, to start guiding us through our first case study.
Okay, we do want to note that the case studies that we're going to be talking about are fictional. They don't depict any actual person or event, and any resemblance to faculty or collaborators, implied or otherwise, is purely coincidental. So our first case study is Lost in Translation, a tale of communication age. So here's you're working with a team that can have never worked on the systematic review before. After your initial meeting, you share materials and information outlining the methodology and the process involved. The team is excited to start and indicates they'll begin working on the protocol. At the next meeting, the team reviews the draft protocol and you begin to develop the search. In the following weeks, you share a preliminary search for the team to review and ask when they are available to meet again. You hear nothing for months and they don't respond to your emails checking in about the project. A year later, the team contacts you to ask why specific articles were not included. You learn that the team submitted the manuscript to a journal and were given feedback by peer reviewers about these specific articles. You also learn that the team took your preliminary search and loaded it into ChatGPT to translate it to other databases. The resulting searches contain syntax errors and incorrect subject headings. You feel confused and maybe a bit annoyed by the team's actions and very concerned about the quality of the systematic review. So a frustrating situation all around. We've got communication issues, a manuscript going to publication without the librarian's input, and kind of suspect use of an AI chatbot. Let's look at the main issues here, and next we'll look at mitigation strategies for these problems. First, the misaligned communication expectations. Everyone responds differently to communication issues. You may not be bothered by unanswered emails, or you might feel confused or annoyed, or you might feel deeply disrespected or disregarded. And all of these are valid reactions. It's just very personal to individuals how they're going to react to these sorts of things. I know that I personally would be annoyed by the lack of updates from the team, and I might assume that the project withered and died, like they do. And then I'd be annoyed all over again if they came back with a submitted manuscript and more problems to address. However, it's important not to assume that the team is intentionally trying to keep you out of the loop. Everyone involved in this project, including the librarian, may be operating under the illusion of transparency, which is when we assume that our internal thoughts, beliefs, and expectations are understood by others. You may assume that the team understands that they should be providing regular updates, but the team may assume that once you've handed over the search, that your contribution is over. Assuming that our expectations are understood without sharing them makes it easy to believe that the other party is willfully violating these expectations. Second, role ambiguity. You probably have a clear understanding of your role in a project like this, but the team that you're working with may be unsure of what your role actually is. Those who are newer to evidence synthesis projects may not have a full understanding of the expertise that you bring in literature searching, controlled vocabulary, and syntax, and your skills in understanding the searchable question. This could potentially lead to situations like the lack of communication or the assumption that your role is concluded once you've shared the draft search with them. To cause headaches in the evidence synthesis world for the foreseeable future. Using artificial intelligence in evidence synthesis is not without controversy, and that is a decision that would need to be discussed and made as a team, and also potentially justified in the manuscript. AI is definitely the hot new thing right now, and that might lead a team into automation bias, which is the assumption that an automated system is more reliable than it actually is. If the team doesn't understand the technology and the expertise needed for a librarian to effectively search the literature, they may think that a generative AI chatbot could do that work for them, and we know that's not true. How do we address issues like these? Well, the best cure is prevention, establishing expectations in the beginning and clearly defining timelines, roles, and communication expectations. Don't fall into the trap of assuming that it's your role. You'll have to explain it to them. Sometimes for particularly complex or challenging projects, it may be helpful to designate an informal project manager for the team. Or you may find it helpful to introduce a formal project management approach and responsibility assignment matrix. One such matrix is called RACI, which establishes the roles for those who are responsible for a particular task, accountable for tasks, and perhaps the project as a whole, consulting members of the team, and members who only need to be informed of progress. Prevention is also the key to addressing role ambiguity. Make sure that you're advocating for and owning the expertise that you bring to the project as a member of the team. Articulate your skills and the scope of your role, including your expectations for authorship or acknowledgement. Evidence synthesis teams, especially less experienced teams or those who have never worked with a librarian before, may not understand the importance of your searching skills, so you have to be the one to tell them and warn them off using generative AI chatbot to imperfectly translate your search. Finally, address issues before moving forward. If a team has been silent, then comes back with what they feel is a completed project that now has a lot of issues, don't just jump back in. Instead, you can invite the team to informally debrief. There are frameworks such as the after-action review model from the WHO, where the team answers questions such as what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, why was there a difference, and what can we learn from this, using objective, non-personal language. A process like this can clarify expectations and establish norms moving forward, and hopefully head off potential future problems. However, sometimes mitigation strategies just don't work. Sometimes the issues you're experiencing with a particular team aren't able to be solved through no fault of the librarian. You can't fix every problem, nor should you be expected to. But it may come down to asking yourself whether or not you want to continue with this project if your expertise isn't respected and valued, and if the team won't communicate with you. When deciding whether it's time to break up with a project like this, ask yourself these reflective questions. Is the team willing to reestablish roles and expectations and ensure methodological rigor? Will they commit to setting and meeting shared communication expectations? Do they respect the expertise that the librarian brings to the table? And finally, if the manuscript were to be published, would you feel that it's an accurate reflection of your work? Would you be pleased to have your name attached as an author or in the acknowledgement? There are no right or wrong answers here, but if you find that the answer to many of these questions is no, then it may be time to rethink your engagement with this particular project. Now I'll hand it back to Caitlin to talk about our next case study.
Great. Thanks very much, Erin. And I'll say I've been smiling along and laughing with some of the comments in the chat. So thank you all for engaging there as well. So moving on to our next case study, which we have titled The Sisyphean Synthesis. So this is a case where you, as the librarian, you're working with a very driven group, but they are inexperienced. So nobody on the project has done any sort of evidence synthesis project in the past, and they're looking for a lot of guidance. And the group is really keen. They are very passionate about the topic, and they are very, very driven, and they want to communicate about it a lot. They are emailing daily, there are text messages, phone calls, an active group chat, and there are also weekly meetings. But the group is also super busy. Maybe you have people who have different schedules and different time zones. So to try and accommodate that, the meetings are all on the weekend. The group is, although very keen and very, very passionate, also a little bit unfocused. So during these meetings are often over an hour long and really discussion and consensus oriented. And sometimes there are not clear outcomes from the meetings. Decisions don't necessarily get made and there aren't any action items. But it's a little bit of a challenging situation because you're there as the librarian in more of a support role. And so you don't necessarily feel like it's that appropriate for you to, start crafting agendas or assigning action items. But nevertheless, it's something you're noticing in observation. And the team is really grateful for librarian expertise and involvement, but it is quite a time commitment, and there doesn't necessarily seem to be a ton of progress that's being made. So on one particular day, you get multiple emails about the project. The group chat is just pinging nonstop, and you don't get around to them because you have other things that you're doing. And then that's followed up by a voicemail the following morning to ask you why it is that you haven't responded yet and whether you can hop on a call to talk about the project. And so you're starting to feel a little bit concerned about the amount of time that you've spent on this project and where the project is currently at. But on the other hand, you're also feeling like, well, I've put so many hours into this project. I've offered up so much expertise that to step away at this point, that just feels like an absolute waste because then all of that will be for naught. So next slide, please. So there are a couple of things that may stand out to you, or at least may stand out to us as being a problem in this scenario. So a few that we wanted to flag. The first is called telepressure. So telepressure is a preoccupation with or an urge to respond to specifically electronic messages, regardless of time or place. It's why, if you maybe even aren't necessarily concerned about an email that you're waiting for, or a chat, or a text message, you may nevertheless check your phone. If you see that you did get that email, you may feel the urge to respond to it, even if it's not necessarily time sensitive. But it is just this sort of feeling that I need to be checking and I need to be responding to these modes of communication. Regardless of whether or not I am in a work context or it's time for my work day. And part of these feelings of telepressure can be associated with what it is we like our boundaries to be. So boundaries are very different for different people, both in terms of what those are, but also in terms of what it is we want those to be. So there is this idea of integration versus segmentation. So integration is when you're a person who prefers to have a more of a flexible boundary between work and personal. You are a person for whom it feels helpful. It helps to alleviate some of the burden to be able to answer that email at 9 p.m. at night. Whereas a person who prefers segmentation really prefers to kind of have that stricter boundary between work and personal. And if you are somebody who prefers that more segmented, stricter boundary, then having those feelings of telepressure, having that those people emailing outside of that can really feel like it's an infringement and it's crossing that boundary. But I did also see this come up in the chat, this idea of a sunk cost fallacy. So sunk cost fallacy is a cognitive bias in which we continue to invest our time, energy, resources into something because we previously invested in it. So it's this idea that I need to keep working on this because I've already worked on this so much. I've put in so much time that I can't possibly not put in more time. But the reason that this is a cognitive bias is that you will never get the time back. That time has already been expended, that's already been spent. So regardless of whether you spend more on that, it doesn't actually change anything about what has already happened. Next slide, please. So these will vary, these mitigation strategies are going to vary a lot depending on what it is that you feel are the actual stressors. So understanding your organizational expectations can be very important, particularly if you are somebody who's feeling that telepressure and it is impacting you negatively. So understanding if and what those expectations are, whether those are formal or informal, is really key. Understanding, does your organization have a set response time, or is there an expectation that you would have availability outside of your regular work hours? And if not, being able to enact those can be very helpful. Communicating and keeping boundaries is also really important. Oftentimes, as Erin was kind of alluding to before, we can assume that people understand or are being intentional with their actions when perhaps they are not. So it is really important to be very explicit with what boundaries are. And one thing I want to make clear is that boundaries and rules are not the same thing. So my boundary can't be don't contact me outside of regular business hours. People are going to do what people are going to do. So it's not about telling other people what they can or cannot do. It's about how it is that I'm going to respond. So if my boundary is that I don't respond to emails outside of regular business hours, then it's not about whether or not people email me or people try and contact me. It's about, do I respond to that? And how do I address that? Now, I will say I find the sunk cost fallacy personally to be the most challenging because sometimes projects just do take time and they do take energy. And so it can be challenging to know what is what is a normal level of investment or of energy to put into something versus what is something that maybe, has kind of into the fallacy space. And so part of that is trying to step back and be objective about things. And that can also include maybe looping in other people to get their perspectives as sort of third parties and to think about what are the probable outcomes of the project at this point in time. Next slide, please. And so these reflective questions are ones that I personally have asked myself before when I was trying to discern between what is that sunk cost fallacy and maybe what is just a more time or labor intensive project. So part of it for me was thinking about whether or not the project still aligned with my professional goals. Was this a valuable learning opportunity? Was I developing skills? Was this going to, lead to a publication, lead to co-authorship, lead to something that is meaningful? Also thinking about, if I was asked to join this project today, and I had not made any previous investment in this whatsoever, would I join the project? Is this something that if it was proposed to me now and I didn't have this history, I would be gung-ho to move forward, or would I have a lot of reservations? And if I was to walk away today, what would I actually lose? What would that cost truly be to me? And then what is the cost of continuing, specifically the opportunity cost? Time is a finite resource. And so if I'm doing this project, what are those other projects that I'm not doing? What are those other opportunities that I'm not taking? And so I found that kind of by going through these questions, it can help me determine whether or not this is a useful investment of further time and further energy, or if it's time to step back a little bit. Right. And on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Nicole.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. So now I'm going to talk about our third and final case study, Ghosts of Review Past. So in this scenario, you coordinate the evidence synthesis service at your library, which is developed and evolved throughout the years, moving from a service where users directly contacted librarians to a more formalized service with a website and an intake form. And although you do not directly supervise the librarians supporting the service, you are aware of their workloads and have concerns about burnout among all the librarians supporting evidence synthesis. The unpredictability of the number of requests can pose a challenge at times, and it is not unknown for projects to start and never see completion. You receive an email from a team that they want an updated search for all databases completed in a week and want to have the manuscript drafted in 2 months. It has been 3 years since the initial search, and they were working with a librarian who has since left your library. Fortunately, you have the practice of when libraries move to a new institution that the librarian deposits all their search strategies into a shared file that you have access to. However, when you look at the file, you find that it only includes the search for one database and that some of the important information is missing, such as some field tags. So it's unfortunately incomplete. Your evidence synthesis service currently has a waiting list for incoming reviews, and you need to integrate this resurrected review into the current workload. It'll take a few weeks before you can even think about this project and what your next steps will be. So hopefully for most people coordinating a service, I'm sure all of us have run into this scenario in one way or another. Next slide. So some of the problems that you notice with this case is that even with clear tiers of service, workloads can vary greatly and be influenced by conferences, downtime in the curriculum, new graduate students or postdoc calendars, and many other factors. And it can be difficult to predict the ebb and flow of user requests through the year, which can create a challenge when managing incoming requests, existing ones, and requests for updates. Job demand resource theory notes that when demands of a job, meaning the elements of the job that require physical or psychological effect, outweigh the available physical, social, psychological, and organizational resources of the job, that there's a negative impact on employee well-being. So Caitlin, talked about burnout at the beginning. So that is one of the factors that can contribute to burnout. And as we all know, burnout among librarians is not unknown, and that there have been several studies about burnout among librarians conducting evidence synthesis. Coordinators of an evidence synthesis service also need to navigate managing a service as well as workloads and burnout among their peers who they may or may not supervise. And this often requires empathy and understanding in what supporting evidence synthesis work may look like and what may be involved among individuals. Libraries and librarians may display status quo bias, which is when they will continue the same behavior even when available resources and circumstances have shifted. I feel like this morning's keynote gave us some really good questions and context to kind of think about that going forward. But it's important to, really think about when you encounter status quo bias, especially in these current times, that this may be an opportunity to reevaluate and change the service. And, that recognizing that also requires cognitive effect or effort. So even though you may have burnout, you still need to kind of like rethink things and be creative. Um, and recognize that there may be a perceived risk involved in changing or perceptions that the current service levels already have been approved and therefore have legitimacy. Next slide. So some mitigation strategies. So what are, some approaches that you can take to maybe mitigate stress and hopefully burnout associated with evidence synthesis, balance individual and service level workflows, etc. So it's important for librarians supporting evidence synthesis service to advocate for the health of the service as well as the librarians supporting it. Advocacy may involve conversations with library leadership about realistic service offerings, particularly if the librarians on the team don't feel empowered to have those conversations with their direct supervisors. And it's important to have these conversations and really lean into library leadership to identify sustainable solutions.
Nicole,
Gathering data about the service, such as incoming requests, active reviews, etc., and framing this around shared goals, such as the desire to support both the sustainable service and the staff, librarians, can help structure this conversation. So this
Nicole,
framing can further the conversation by focusing on those rather goals rather than just the pain points.
Nicole, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we
Yes.
do need to move to the next
Oh,
session.
sorry.
Can you just
Okay.
take a quick moment to wrap the last part of your slides?
Yes. Let's
Yeah,
see. Let's
I
just go
can
to the questions quick. You got it, Erin?
yes. So the last part of our presentation was just about like if you do need to step away from a project, like that's a difficult decision, and then actually doing it is difficult as well. So here are some tips for making the decision and having the conversation where you need to step away. We have a book chapter coming out about this soon-ish. And here are some of our references. Sorry for going over. Thank you so much, everybody.